strong opinions about things and I have my perspective, but ultimately I really believe that all of us in the realm, in life, but in the realm of health are our own best authority. And so I'm not like paleo or gluten-free or this or that, like diet approach. Personally, I am more like all of us are individuals, and that was one of the things that drew me to the program that I did, was it really included that reality that we are biologically individual. We have different backgrounds, we have different genetic makeups, and so what we eat for optimal health will be different depending on the different person. And then obviously depending on the bioregion that we live in and how active we are, and the kind of work that we do and the kind of stress that we're under and all those things. And so I just want to say that I'm not here to like tell you what to eat or what not to eat, but just share some information that I think should be part of like elementary school education, and discuss some things that probably you have heard lots of different things about, or you're curious about, or you think you know, or you think you don't know, and just like provide a space where we can talk about that. And I know a lot. I love reading and studying, and there's a lot I don't know too. So I'm just here to share what I do know and open up a space of dialogue. So unfortunately my printer broke right as I was printing these lovely handouts that I made, but I will have Hannah email them to everybody. I'll just send them out in email. So I want to start out with what is nutrition anyway. Anybody have and there's no wrong answer, right answer. What is nutrition?
Vitamins and minerals that our body needs to survive.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Any other perspectives? I love that there's the food sizzling in the background all the time. It's great.
Yeah. It's what we intake to have an optimal health.
Yeah, totally.
I think almost what you were just saying about the food sizzling is a part of nutrition that a lot of times isn't taken into consideration, like the mental, emotional, psychological part of ingesting food. You could be eating a perfectly healthy meal, but if it's in the car or when you're super stressed out and just not doing it, I think that's also part of nutrition.
Yeah, totally.
And also the positive aspect, celebrating what you're eating in a group and eating it in a nice setting, and I think all that is nutrition too.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Yeah, the official definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary is the act or process of nourishing or being nourished. Specifically, the sum of the processes by which an animal or plant takes in and utilizes food substances. So I really like that definition because it incorporates the things that you were just mentioning, and the vitamins and the minerals and all the different things and how it interacts with our health. But it's the sum of the parts, right? It's like any other ecological, biological process. It's not there's some, what is the book where they make Soylent Green, the perfect nutrition pill, it's like that concept of we just need this many units of all these different things and then we'll be healthy. It's not true. It's not true in the soil for plants, it's not true for people either. So it's the sum of the processes and it's the whole experience of eating. And, you could argue the whole experience from growing the food to the eating of the food, even if you're not a part of it, the energy that goes into it. That's, up to your opinion whether you think that is included, but it could be. And it's interesting, too, to notice that the word nourish is etymologically related to the word nurse, to suckle a baby. And there have been many scientific studies that have shown that babies don't just need milk, but they need the warmth and the closeness and the touch and making eye contact and smelling their caregivers and all of these different things. And so again, that really illustrates the idea and the concept that nourishment and nutrition are not just about XYZ amounts of these different nutrients and things that we need in and out. It's a bigger picture than that. So some of the elements are fat, protein, carbohydrates, minerals, vitamins. Water is one that is often overlooked as part of nutrition, but it's totally a part of it, in my opinion. Like you said, connection, emotions around food, connection with our food in the sensual realm of tasting and smelling what we're eating. And biologically, that actually makes a really big difference too. When we start to smell food, it begins this cascade of biological processes that allow healthy digestion to happen. And so we start to secrete saliva, when you smell something, you salivate. But there's all these other secretions further down the line in our digestive system that start to be released as well, like stomach acid and bile, that are necessary to actually take in nutrients. So there's this concept of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system. Does everybody know what that is? Mm-hmm. Can anybody want to explain what it is? I can, but
Your fight or flight.
mm-hmm. That's the sympathetic nervous system. It's like when you're in fight or flight. And then some people call the parasympathetic rest and digest. And so our bodies are very smart, right? And when we're making and using energy all the time, our hearts are pumping blood around, our brain is doing lots of crazy, conducting electricity and telling our nerves what to do and sort of orchestrating the whole magical being of our body. And at any given time, depending on what we need to do, our body can sort of shunt energy and blood flow to different parts of the body because they're what we need in that moment. And so the fight or flight system, the sympathetic nervous system, happens when we're in a stress situation. So, we're adapted to we're picking berries and all of a sudden a predator comes or an avalanche happens and we need to get out of there and run really fast. And so our nervous system shunts blood flow to like our big leg muscles, to our lungs, to our heart, away from our digestive system and our reproductive system. Because in that moment when we're trying to escape from a predator avalanche, we're not gonna like have a snack or make love, right? We're like gonna get out of there and save our lives. And so conversely, when we're calm and relaxed and we're gonna eat and or like cuddle a baby or do those calm and relaxed things, then our body shunts blood flow away from the lungs and the big muscles and the fight or flight kind of parts of our body and towards the digestion and the reproductive organs.
Yeah, hi Hazel. You have some potato?
Cool. So that's what Kate was mentioning about like eating on the go, eating in the car. You could be eating a perfectly balanced meal, but if you're in fight or flight mode, then your body just doesn't have the energy in the right place to be able to utilize all those nutrients. And then there's the bio-individuality and the genetic and cultural background. So all of us, as similar as we could seem, we're all different biologically too and have different genetic backgrounds. And so one example of that bio-individuality is people who evolved closer to the ocean and people who evolved further away from the ocean. And so people who evolved close to the ocean had access to a lot of fish and seafood to eat, right? And so omega-3 fatty acids, probably everyone's heard of those, they're very high in seafood. And people whose ancestors evolved closer to the ocean can really easily, are used to digesting and utilizing omega-3 fatty acids in the form that they're in animal products and in fish. And then people who lived further away from the ocean sometimes had to get their omega-3 fatty acids from plant sources more than animal sources because they're just less abundant in animal sources where you don't have that concentrated fish oily fish. And so those people genetically can break down the form of omega-3 fatty acids that are found in plants and use them just as easily as they can. They can kind of go back and forth and use either plant-based or animal-based omega-3s. Whereas some people whose ancestors evolved eating lots of oily fish, their system just doesn't know how to do the process to break down the plant-based omega-3 fatty acids, and so you can't get as much of those good essential fatty acids from plant sources like flax seeds. So that's just an example, and there's tons of them. There's tons of them that nobody has studied that we don't know about, because people's ancestors have evolved in different bioregions with different kinds of diets and different kinds of needs, and our bodies adapt. So that's I think a fascinating area and something to return to if you're like trying out a new diet or a new nutritional protocol and it's not working for you. It's like it's not for everybody. Some people are like gluten-free or dairy-free. Those are definitely big allergens that a lot of people have issues with, but some people can digest them fine. And so again, returning to your own authority. What was your question?
I have a comment. There's a place called a Puron in Asheville that you can literally bring in your genetic, 23andMe test, and they'll look at your genetic snips and tell you exactly what you're supposed to eat based on your
Wow.
Yeah.
What are they basing it
genes.
on,
Just different snips in your genetics
DNA.
that tell you about your ancestral
Yeah.
heritage
Cool.
and what your
That's
ancestors
fascinating.
ate.
What's
What's
the name
it
of that
called?
company?
Apeiron, Apeiron, and get David Krantz.
David Krantz.
Krantz?
I'm gonna write that
David
down.
Krantz.
Somebody
Krantz.
else write that down.
Krantz.
Cool.
Yeah.
Down for that?
Yeah. So that's a really important thing to think about. And then absorption and bioavailability. So an example of this concept is corn. So corn has a lot of different B vitamins in it, but some of them are not bioavailable. If you just, oh, thank you. Nice one.
Oh my god,
She was so pleased.
Yeah,
Mushroom. Nice.
It's a mushroom.
Mushroom.
You want to get one?
Corn. So a lot of people here in the South still eat a lot of corn, but their diet consisted a lot of corn, like corn grits and cornmeal, cornbread, and they would get this disease called pellagra, which is a deficiency of niacin, which is one of the B vitamins. But then people in Mesoamerica who kind of co-evolved with corn and process their corn in an alkaline solution before they prepare it, so they make nixtamal and that flavor of like tortillas, how the corn is a little bit different. And everywhere where corn is a part of the traditional culture, they have some process where they use a lye solution to cook the corn. They don't get pellagra. They don't have a niacin deficiency. And so people looked into this, and it's because the niacin in the corn is bound up unless you process it in the lye solution. And so if you eat just ground up corn and you don't do this processing, then and that's the main staple of your diet, then you'll become deficient in this B vitamin, which is in the corn, just not available to people. And so there's lots of other examples of that. And that's another place where, like, you can't just say, well, this has this, and this has this, and this has this, and I'm eating these things, so I'm getting these things. It's more complex than that. And then absorption has everything to do with digestion. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And then another thing to consider are cofactors. And so different nutrients can only be utilized by the body in the presence of other cofactors. And a great example of this is vitamin C. So vitamin C was one of the first vitamins to be kind of zeroed in on as like, what is this thing? You know, vitamins are kind of a made-up concept. And vitamin C was one of the first ones to be zeroed in on, like, okay, we're going to call this vitamin C, even though in natural foods there aren't really these isolated individual vitamins. They're all these different phytocompounds that occur in combination with each other. And so if you take just straight up vitamin C, your body doesn't absorb very much of it. But if you take it in combination with bioflavonoids, which are these other plant-based compounds that always are made by plants that also make vitamin C in a natural setting, then your body can utilize it. So bioflavonoids are a cofactor that allows your body to utilize vitamin C. And there's lots and lots of examples of those too. And then, of course, the quality of food. So you can take an orange and an orange and an orange from 3 different places, and they'll be different. You know, they'll have generally the same makeup, but there have been tests done on bottled orange juice on a shelf in a store that has 0 vitamin C in it, because it's been pasteurized and heat destroys vitamin C because it's been sitting on the shelf for a long time, and just oxidation and vitamin C degrades over time. And then you can pick an orange right off the tree and it can be full of vitamin C. And then you can pick an orange right off of a tree that's been grown in poor, deficient soil and it has less vitamin C than one that was grown in rich soil. So that's another factor to consider. So I think the first thing to think about when you think about nutrition and having healthy nutrition in our own bodies and our own lives is digestion. Because, oh, thanks. Here, I have something for you too.
Oh man.
Oh boy.
Lucky.
Actually, Hazel, here, let me get a fork. Pass this around.
Want a fork?
Yeah, will you grab me a fork? Thank you. Hey, do you want some salt on your cucumber? Maybe a sprinkle.
Nice.
So yeah, if everybody can take 2 pieces of cucumber, here's some salt if you want to sprinkle on, and just eat one and hold on to the other one. Just pass around as I'm talking. And you don't have to if you don't feel like eating a cucumber, but it's a little exercise that we're going to do.
Put salt on the first one? Or
Just put salt if you want to put salt. You don't. It's just an option. Optional salt.
Carrie doesn't eat cucumbers,
well,
so
you got two.
is there another option for her? Can she have some of my tomato maybe?
Yeah, totally. That sounds
Here,
great.
Carrie. Have some of my tomato. I'll bring you some
Yeah.
tomato.
So just eat one piece as we're talking, and then we'll do something else with the other piece in a minute. So our digestive system is basically, some people call it like the big donut hole. So from our mouth to our bottom is a big tube. It's not actually inside of our body. And so food goes through this big tube and goes through all these different processes. But by both mechanical and chemical action, food has to be broken down into small enough particles that it can actually go through the lining of our intestines and into our blood. And that's when it's actually inside of our body, and that's when it's actually nourishing our body. But it does other important things as it goes through, but it's not actually inside of us just because we put it in our mouth. And we don't actually absorb it and release the parts that we don't need just because it's gone through us. So there are a lot of things that affect our ability to digest well. And going from top to bottom, it starts out with what Kate was mentioning, like our mentality and our attitude when we're eating. And so eating on the go and eating when we're thinking about something else, eating in that fight or flight sympathetic nervous system, our bodies just can't, it's not that it's not a choice. They just can't digest well when we're doing other things and when our energy physically and mentally are in another place. And when we're calm and relaxed and focused, then our bodies have a better ability to do that. Another thing is chewing the food. And so the teeth are really the part of our body that's made to mechanically break up the food into smaller pieces. And when we don't do that with our teeth, our stomach churning, the muscles in our stomach churning can do it a little bit, but there's not really, we don't have a gullet like a bird with stones in it to crunch down the food. So when we don't do that with our mouth, we're putting stress on the rest of the digestive system by putting big chunks of food that go down further into our digestive system. Then the next step, and in the saliva are also some enzymes that begin the chemical breakdown of food too. And then the next step is stomach acid. And so having a very acidic environment in the stomach not only breaks down proteins and liberates some of the B vitamins from foods that have them, but it also turns the contents of our stomach into a very acidic solution. And the acidity of that stimulates and signals the next step in digestion to happen. And so if we don't have enough acidity in our stomach and we aren't in that relaxed, restful state when we are eating, then the whole process gets sort of backed up if we don't have that acidity, because it's like a domino effect. It's not like each thing just happens on its own accord, because we're not digesting all the time. And so those secretions and those chemical activities that break down the food aren't just constantly being pumped out. They have to be signaled, like, okay, food is coming down. Okay, release the acid. Okay, acidic, solution is coming down. Release the bicarbonate. Release the bile. So it's a step-by-step process. And some things that can reduce stomach acid are if we eat a lot of sugar and carbohydrates and alcohol also. In excess, it's not like don't ever eat those things, but when the diet, like the standard American diet, is very, very heavy on refined carbohydrates, alcohol, and sugars, and other sugars, those are all sugars, but it can tax the cells in the stomach that release stomach acid, making them less able to do their job, which then inhibits the whole digestive process further down the line. Then the next part is bile is released by the liver, and bile breaks down fats and emulsifies fats so that we can take them into our system. And the liver is kind of like this magician that does over 500 different things in our body that are all really, really important. And the liver, I imagine the liver as like this magician that has this really big book with all these recipes. And they're flipping through and changing around the chemical structure of all these different things, cleaning our blood, creating bile, breaking down things that come in and using their individual parts to make other things that our body needs. So it's pretty amazing what our liver does. And there's lots of things that can tax our liver. Again, eating a diet too heavily weighted in the direction of sugars and carbohydrates and alcohol Eating a diet devoid of the bitter flavor, so bitter and sour flavors really nourish the liver and help to stimulate it and cleanse it. Just eating a diet that's too heavy in toxins, including toxic foods like artificial colorings and flavorings and unhealthy fats. And sorry, I'm a little bit distracted. Hormones. So when our body is naturally making a lot of hormones and out of balance in our hormone production, or if we're taking in hormones either intentionally, like birth control pills or anything that we would take that's a hormone-based medicine, but also just the hormones that are in the food supply and the toxins that are in the food supply and the pharmaceutical drugs that are in the food supply. So all of that stuff has to get dealt with by the liver. And when the liver is taxed, it can't do its other jobs, other 500 jobs. So the liver is a huge important part of the digestive process. And then from there, it goes into the small and then the large intestine. And that's where the whole microbiome is happening. And there's all of these different bacteria and yeasts and protozoans and all of these different organisms that help us break down food and get the nutrients out of food. And there's lots of things that we can do to imbalance or nourish that part of our digestive system too. They're kind of like, they're like on our team. And without a healthy ecosystem in our digestive system, we can't take in as much of the nourishment from food that we could, with them on board. And conversely, if we have an overgrowth of some pathologic or harmful microorganisms in our digestive system, then that can also inhibit our ability to take in nutrition. So it's a complicated thing, and it can be a little overwhelming, but it can also be approached really simply. So again, like being calm when we eat. So now we're going to eat the next piece of cucumber, but I'm going to stop talking, and we're each going to take 3 deep breaths before we do, and we're really going to taste it and imagine that whole process that I just described, beginning with the cucumber going into our mouth. So, ready? Feel your breath going down to your belly. And whenever you're ready, just slowly chew and taste the cucumber or whatever you're eating. So it can really be that simple, of just letting your body do what it knows how to do. Did anybody have a different experience with cucumber each time?
Tastes sweeter.
A cucumber is not the best thing to do this with, but that's what I had, so.
Yeah. It's interesting.
What would you choose? If you could choose anything to do that experiment with, what would you?
I think something with protein in it.
Steak.
Or just like something that, I don't know for what reason. Cucumber just feels like it's easy on the digestive system because it's mostly water. So it doesn't feel that, and it doesn't have a strong flavor, but it also, I don't know.
At the same time, though, like for me, like the sensory thing, like I felt it crunch, and like you could hear it crunch.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Cucumber is fine.
Yeah.
That's good.
Definitely.
And if
works.
anybody wants more cucumbers, I don't know where they got to, but help yourself. So yeah, just taking a few deep breaths before you start eating actually will make a huge difference. Like there have been studies, and it makes a huge difference. So it can be really simple. The bitter and sour flavors also, just having bitters, that you can make, or just picking a dandelion leaf if you're out in a place where you can do that right before you're eating and chewing on it. Putting lemon in or vinegar in your water while you're, and have a few sips before you sit down to eat. Something that simple can make a big difference. Eating your foods warm or at least room temperature also make a difference, because inside your body, your digestive system is about 98.6 degrees. And so anything that goes in really cold takes energy to heat up. and that takes some of the digestive fire or the blood flow to the digestive organs to get it from cold to warm enough. So if you are eating cold foods, just taking it slowly, not like chugging a bunch of cold liquid or eating a bunch of, frozen yogurt or ice cream really fast, that can become hard on the system. And drinking enough water can really help digestion too, but not during meals so much. Sipping water during meals is fine, but if you drink a lot of water while you're eating, it can water down all of those digestive juices that I was talking about. Eating probiotic and raw foods with every meal if you can, like something raw or fermented, even if it's just a little something with each meal, can really help. And then limiting all the stuff that can be damaging to the digestive system, like refined carbohydrates and sugar, alcohol, and toxic fats, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and anything that isn't actually food. It's usually good to avoid, like artificial flavorings and colorings and stuff. And then bone broth and gelatin. Gelatin is really interesting in that, and that naturally occurs in bone broth, in that so some foods are hydrophobic and some are hydrophilic, and so they either repel water or they absorb water. And what gelatin does is it kind of neutralizes the scene. It helps water be attracted to all of the food in your belly with the meal that you're eating with the bone broth or the gelatin. And so it just helps the digestive process happen because the digestive process is very juicy and watery. It's all these different fluids and liquids mixing in with your food. So having gelatin helps that process just go more smoothly, and your body has to work less hard to make that happen.
What might be some sources? Like, are you saying like literally just have some
Yeah.
of the jelly stuff, or what?
Yeah, you can do that. I mean, bone broth is nice because you can make like gravies and sauces with it. Or I mean, what I do often is I'll just like, if I'm gonna cook rice, I'll just cook it in some bone broth, and so that it's not gonna be jelly, but the gelatin is in there. And making like chutneys and jams and jellies that have gelatin in them and just have a spoonful. That's a nice way too. So those are the ways that I incorporate that.
Okay.
Yeah, I do make Jello sometimes because it's fun. It's natural Jello out of fruit juice, but that doesn't go with every meal. It's like, oh, my cube of Jello with every meal. Don't do that, especially in the winter. Don't really want Jello. All right, so that's sort of the overview of digestion. I know this class is not about digestion, but I feel like it's so important to talk about that when we're talking about nutrition, because when we don't address digestion, even if we're eating a perfect diet, it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't not matter, but it sort of makes or breaks how effective those good nutritional choices are if we're paying attention to our digestive process. So, what should we eat? Like, all of this information, what should we be eating? I like to come back to the three ideas of quality, balance, and diversity. So eating the best quality food that we can get our hands on. And what is quality? What does that mean to have high quality food?
Organic.
Why?
Because it's 25 to 50% higher in more vitamins and nutrients than, and it's it's not a GMO.
I think a better food is one I've grown my own, or wild food.
Yeah.
Grown in good soil. Good climate. Lack of weird stuff like toxic pesticides and fertilizers.
Yeah.
I mean, quality can mean a lot of things.
Yeah,
Quality
that's
can
what I'm
mean-
asking you
Yeah,
guys. Like, what
quality
does that
can
mean to you?
like, it's like the illusion of a choice. Like, you're going to eat a vegetable with, but which vegetable is better? Like,
Right.
Like there's all these like superfoods, right? That all these everybody wants to eat all these superfoods, but the reality is like, broccoli is better than a lot of, or just as good as a lot of other superfoods, or like a banana in water is just as good as coconut water. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So quality can just be like what you actually need in that moment as well.
That's a really good point. Quality for each of us as individuals could be different because what we need is different. But yeah, I'd say sort of definitively, I like this little conversation over here, like organic, like certified organic is meaning less and less. The Trump administration is trying to change it to mean even less than it already means. And there are lots of small farms, my own farm included, that are not certified because there's a lot of bureaucratic steps and bullshit to becoming certified. It costs money to be certified. So the concept of organically grown produce, I think I agree, and there have been many studies to show that they're higher in nutrients. But sometimes having the organic certification versus not having the certification doesn't tell you much about the quality of the food. It does tell you that it's not a genetically modified organism, and it tells you that it hasn't been sprayed with certain synthetic pesticides and herbicides. But there are a lot of very toxic pesticides and herbicides that are derived from natural materials. So the decision in the current organic standards of whether or not it can be certified organic is not based on whether it's toxic or not. It's based on whether it's derived from natural ingredients or not.
Like natural flavors.
Isn't it like a catch-22?
Yeah.
It sounds just ridiculous.
It is kind of. And I mean, it's part of a bigger thing. Like, regulating the food system on a national level is kind of crazy.
Right.
So, like you said, like something you picked in your own garden, yeah, then you know. And the nutrient degradation of a lot of different nutrients starts immediately when the food is picked.
Right.
And so the fresher that it is, so something picked from your own garden versus something that's certified organic but shipped from Colombia, you know, it depends. It depends. But those are factors to consider. And unfortunately, there isn't like, I go to the store and this is good and this isn't good. It's like something that we have to continue to ask questions about and to look into.
I think the other thing about quality too is like it can be certified organic, but I feel very responsible about like what if it's a monocrop essentially,
Right.
like organic, like that might
Totally.
probably have a lot of the nutrients and stuff that maybe a not necessarily certified product would.
Yeah.
So.
So those are things to think about. But just thinking that like you know, a broccoli isn't a broccoli isn't a broccoli. That the quality of your food varies depending on all kinds of things, from how it was grown to when it was picked to how long it has been since it was, you know, picked, and how it's been handled since then. Was it brought right to a refrigerator? Has it been sitting out for a long time? All of those kinds of things. And then balance. You know, I mean, it's funny because I was like came in and you guys were pouring some wine, like, oh no, we shouldn't drink the wine for the nutrition class, and like,
That's why nobody is. It's open and nobody's drinking.
Open the bottle.
Now it's open.
I didn't know it was open.
and that's the thing. I mean, that whole conversation on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, a huge sort of toxic experience in the human body is stress. And so when we're stressed out about what we're eating, when we're like, if you can't drink the wine and be like, I'm gonna really enjoy this wine and the antioxidants and the calming, you know, impact of it, and I'm just gonna enjoy this glass of wine. If you're like, oh, this wine is taxing my liver, and I don't know if I should really be drinking it, and have I had too much, and oh, I had wine 2 days ago, I think that's too much, and
Am I the only one drinking?
yeah, if that's in your mind when you're drinking it, then it changes how that substance is nourishing you. And that is true for anything that you're eating. So, you know, I always love the example of like going to see a family member, a relative who loves making something sweet or making something deep fried or something that you ordinarily maybe wouldn't eat. But they're making it with love, you know, and you have this connected experience.
Yep.
And that's up to you. Like, there's certain things that even in that situation, I will choose not to eat. Like hydrogenated fats. I don't want them in my body, and I'll say no thank you. But there's certain things, like sugar, that I'll have some flexibility around, because it's like, oh, somebody made this with love. Or when I'm traveling, like, I have no idea what's in the food sometimes, but if somebody invites me into their home and serves me a meal. And so I think just staying in balance and staying in touch with ourselves, and again, returning to our own authority, is not only just, in my opinion, a good idea, but biologically, if you look at that stress response and how that affects our ability to take in nutrition, there's a biological basis to having some balance and flexibility. And then diversity is another one that is really important to consider. You know, especially these days with so many food allergies and contamination issues, people will be like, okay, I'm going to eat, you know, leafy greens and chia seeds and grass-fed beef, and those things are good for me, and I don't know about all this other stuff. And if that's all you eat over and over and over again, it's taxing on your system. And if that's all you eat, whether it's hot, whether it's cold, whether you had an active day, whether you had a restful day, it's not really responding to the reality of your experience. And so having diversity as your life changes, as the season and the temperature changes, as your activity changes, is part of having good nutrition and responding to that. You know, when it's colder, eating heavier foods and warmer foods. When you're more active, eating more in general, you know, drinking more water. And when you're kind of quieter and more still, just eating less foods and foods that are easier to digest. You know, you can use common sense, but not getting too stuck in like, these are the good foods and everything else is gonna hurt me, you know, which I understand how people get to that point, because the world of food in this time is very confusing and overwhelming, and people are dealing with a lot of health issues and allergies, and so I understand that. I'm not trying to, you know, knock anybody's approach to taking care of themselves, but diversity is key. So the next thing is whole foods, eating foods in the form that they were created in nature. And the only exception to that I would say is like certain foods, like the example that I gave with the corn, are actually more nutritious after some kind of home scale traditional processing. So like fermenting foods can release nutrition that we couldn't get if they weren't fermented. Cooking the corn in the lye solution allows us to get the B vitamins. So there's certain things like that, but they've been done by humans for a long time. The food processing industry is what I'm talking about when I talk about avoiding processed foods, which is basically the goal of which is to be able to have more shelf-stable food that shouldn't be shelf-stable. Basically taking food that would decompose, that was alive and would decompose and degrade, and turning it into something that is static. So lots of fruits and vegetables, fresh, cooked, and fermented. That's always a good sort of foundation to a healthy diet. That's what people have been eating, and pre-people, you know, hominids have been eating for a long, long time as a foundation, fruits and vegetables in all different forms. So just coming back to that, depending on what's available and in the season.
Should you eat the fermented foods a little bit before you actually eat a meal? Does that help?
I don't think, I wouldn't say on the whole that's necessary. I think for some people that might be good, but incorporating them with the meal is also fine. Yeah. And then plenty of healthy fats, saturated fat, unsaturated fat, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, omega-3, 6, and 9. I'll talk a little bit more about all those things, but fat is good for you, it's necessary, and there isn't any kind of naturally occurring fat that's like in and of itself harmful or bad, which is something that a lot of us have been told for a long time, and that's more and more scientific evidence is coming out to really debunk that idea.
Actually showing we need more good fats.
And then adequate protein throughout the day. So not just having protein, not having like a big steak at dinner, but not having had protein throughout the day, having it throughout the day. And personally, I eat meat, and I think that our bodies have evolved eating some amount of animal protein, but I think that I'm not going to say whether or not everybody should be eating meat or not be eating meat. I think it's the level of animal protein that is really optimal for individuals is different. And there's lots of good reasons why people choose not to eat animal protein, and I think with care, especially around protein and fat, that a non-animal protein diet can be just fine. So I'm not going to, And then fresh, clean water also throughout the day is a very big, important part of nutrition. So what shouldn't we eat? Any ideas? I've mentioned a few things already.
Processed food.
Processed foods, totally.
Anything in the middle of the grocery store.
Yep. The island of non-food. So yeah, artificial colors, flavors, preservatives. And someone mentioned something about natural flavoring. It's really interesting. Just like with the organic standards, what's called natural flavorings in food can be the exact same molecule as an artificial flavoring, but it was derived from a natural source rather than being derived from basically like what's that? What is like oil, gas? There's a word. Petroleum products. Thank you.
You mean that MSG could be a natural flavoring?
Yeah.
They would feel it.
Sometimes the natural flavorings that are derived from natural sources are actually more harmful than the ones that are from petroleum.
It's true. It's just this strange,
it's just weird
regulatory decision that was made. So if natural flavoring does not mean herbs and spices, if you buy a package of food and it says natural flavorings, it means something that was developed in a lab. So avoiding that is really good. And a lot of things that you wouldn't expect to have natural flavorings have them at the very bottom. Like yogi tea. The other day I had a yogi tea bag and they had natural flavorings. Like, yogi tea, come on! Come on, yogi tea. But yeah. So trans fats, hydrogenated fats and oils, and damaged fats and oils. Anybody know what trans fats are? So technically speaking, trans fats are, it's a shape of a fat molecule that has this open, it has a part of it that is open to, it's very reactive. And so it reacts with other things. And trans fats naturally occur in very, very small amounts in the fat of ruminant animals like goats and sheep and cows, very, very small amounts. But other than that, don't exist in nature. They were developed because in the, I forget when, but at the advent of electricity, Procter & Gamble were just starting out and were a company making candles and soap, and they had a big corner on the cottonseed oil industry. And when electricity came around, people started buying a lot less candles. And at the time, people were used to cooking with solid fat like lard. And so they didn't know what to do with all this cottonseed oil. And there was a German chemist whose name I can't remember at the moment, who developed the process of hydrogenation, of turning liquid fat into solid at room temperature fat that was much more stable in terms of it wouldn't go rancid as quickly sitting on the shelf. And you can use it in cooking in the same way as tallow and things like that. And so that was like the advent of Crisco and the advent of hydrogenated oils. But unfortunately, although it worked like those naturally saturated fats in cooking, it doesn't work like those naturally saturated fats in our bodies. And so you can look, I wish I had a picture of a cell membrane. All of the membranes around every single cell in our bodies are made of phospholipids. They're made of fat and phosphorus. And it's like this neatly arranged little ring of molecules. And when there's a trans fat molecule in there, it's as though someone put like a bent up coat hanger right in the cell membrane. And so our bodies just can get very confused, and they don't do the same things as other fat molecules. They freak out our liver and tax our liver, so bad idea. And they're in a lot of baked goods, packaged crackers and cookies, and anything that said trans fats or hydrogenated fats or oils are just really not food, and your body can't use them and are to be avoided.
Can I ask a question?
Uh-huh.
Regarding lard. Do you still consider that a trans?
No. Lard is not a trans fat.
And what's your opinion if, let's say, twice a year you were to make something using lard versus all the other?
Why only twice a year? I eat lard almost every day.
Do you really?
I do. I raised a hog and I have a lot of lard.
Okay, I'll tell you where I'm coming from. My mother makes the most amazing pies, and her
and
crust,
she puts lard in the crust,
and she uses lard in the crust, and of course she's getting ready to go have an open heart surgery, and I'm always telling her you need to tweak some of the things that you're cooking with. I've never criticized her about the lard. It's mainly other stuff with a lot of sodium and but with what you were just saying, you know, it makes sense. I mean, they used lard generations and generations ago before all this.
Yeah, and there was not an issue with heart disease and all of the degenerative diseases that we see today when we were using traditional fats.
So the trans fats and the hydrogenated stuff comes from what?
Laboratories. They're made by people.
Yeah.
And they put them in
oil.
It comes from cottonseed oil and soybean oil a lot these days. Any liquid at room temperature oil can be turned into hydrogenated oil. But the cheapest oils are soybean oil and cottonseed oil. Safflower oil, sometimes canola or rapeseed.
So could you make like hydrogenated olive oil per se?
You could, but nobody does because olive oil is worth more as olive oil. Yeah, and people seek it out as olive oil. So like hydrogenated fat, they make out of cheap liquid at room temperature oils, which are often, like in the case of cottonseed oil, a byproduct of another industry. And they're very stable. So you can have a muffin at Ingles sitting there in its little plastic clamshell for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it doesn't become rancid. Neither does it mold, which is worth considering. If you're gonna eat something like that.
They did this study. It was like McDonald's cheeseburger.
Oh yeah.
They used that, and they like buried it, and they like pulled it out like a year later, and it was like
The same.
still
So
exactly the
weird.
same. I was like, never again. I was like 18 when that study came out.
So another thing,
Yeah.
so another thing to consider with fats
not eat it.
is that any fat that was at one point a healthy fat can become damaged, and damaged either by heat or oxidation. Damaged fat can also wreak havoc on your body, and so eating, you know, if you're gonna fry foods, if you're gonna heat oils up really high, choose the right kind of oils for heating up really high. So delicate oils like walnut oil and flaxseed oil, and even olive oil can be heated to a certain level, but not all,
Coconut
not
oil's good.
like deep frying.
Right?
Coconut oil is pretty good. Tallow
Avocado
is good. Lard.
oil.
Avocado oil is good. Sesame oil is pretty good for higher heat cooking. But even if you use good oils for high heat, you'd never want it to smoke. So if oil smokes, you know, I've had this experience where I put a bunch of like nice organic coconut oil, and I like walk into the other room, I forget about it, I come back, it's smoking, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to throw it away, it's messy, and I just want to fry my whatever, and I'm like, no, dump it out, start again, not worth it. So you never want oils to smoke.
You were saying that flax and walnut are good for high heat?
No, not good
Not
for high
good
heat.
for
They're
high heat.
yeah, so they're the polyunsaturated, the most volatile. Most of the seed oils are the most volatile and should be just kept in the fridge and kept cold. But you can always smell oil too. You can smell the rancidity of oil. And in general, you don't want to keep oil around for more than a year. So you can write, you know, if it's an oil that you don't use that much, just write the date when you open it up, and then if it's still there a year later, smell it, and it probably won't smell as great as it did, and you know, just use it for something else. Yeah, oil some boards or oil your skin. Your skin, maybe not so much, but oil something else that needs oiling.
What happens to the, do you know what happens specifically in our body when we eat damaged fats?
It's the same thing like I was saying with the hydrogenated fat. It's not quite as extreme, and our body can clear it out more easily than the hydrogenated fats. But our liver is in charge of fat in our bodies.
Okay.
And we need all these different forms of fats. And so we take in, you know, the essential fatty acids and some other fats too, and we break them down into their constituent parts, and then the liver breaks them down into their constituent parts. And then it's basically like the liver is like this wizard, and he's got his book, or she has their book of all their spells, and then their like shop and their warehouse of all the things. And so they break them apart, and then they have them stored, and when they need to make a hormone, for example, they take some of those fats and put them together with some proteins and make the hormone that our body needs to do what it needs to do. Let's say we're about to ovulate, you know, it makes the hormones that tell our body to ovulate, and it takes all the constituent parts from those fats and puts them into our bloodstream to make, you know, there's the hormone. That's like a little bit simplified, but generally speaking. And like I said, the cell membranes of every cell in our body are made of these phospholipids, so they're made of fat. And the cell membranes have to be semi-permeable, so they let some things into the cells and let waste products out of the cells, but it has to be very selective, because there's all kinds of things swimming around in our bloodstream, in our interstitial fluid, that we don't want to let into our cells, and there's waste products that need to get let out and not held in. And so they have to have sort of an intelligence, you might say. And when the cell membranes are too permeable or not permeable enough, it can cause problems in our cells. And our cells can get overloaded with waste products, or they can not receive nutrition as well, or they can just get kind of flabby and floppy and not hold their shape, and their organelles don't do what they need to do. So, and it's as simple as like fats that are solid at room temperature and more saturated give more structure to the cell membranes. And fats that are really liquid at room temperature, like olive oil will get solid if you put it in the fridge, but flax oil won't. So that's kind of like the range of, that's a way to see how saturated a fat is to get it cold and see, I mean, yeah, if it's at room temperature, it's totally solid, then see how high of a heat it needs to become liquid. And the higher the heat it needs to become liquid, the more saturated it is. So they behave that same way when they make up our cell membranes. If all we eat is polyunsaturated, not enough saturated fats, then our cell membranes are like loose, you know, and floppy, and they can't hold their shape. And if all we eat is saturated fat, then they're too stiff and brittle and not permeable enough. So again, balance and diversity is really important. Does that make sense? Fats. Cool.
Bring on the bacon.
Yeah. So the other things not to eat are too much sugar and carbohydrates are just rampant in our modern world and are not good for our bodies. And then animal products from animals that are living in unhealthy conditions. So again, I'm not going to like tell you whether or not you should eat animal products. I think that's individual choice. I personally choose to. But when an animal is raised, or a plant for that matter, but more for animals, and they're eating a diet that their body is not adapted to, and they're fed a bunch of hormones and antibiotics, and they're living in conditions where they can't behave like an animal, then the food from their body, whether that's eggs or dairy or their flesh, is not healthy. It's not good for you. And so making the choice to spend the big bucks or spend the time raising healthy animals is really worthwhile. Because any sort of toxins that animal is exposed to, whether because they're in a stress condition or because they're eating things that have toxins in them, get concentrated in their fats and in their flesh. And then that's the part that we eat, the concentrated form. So animal products are really important. You know, people are like, oh, organic vegetables, organic fruit. Yes, but if your budget or whatever your lifestyle, you have to choose between organic fruits and vegetables and organic animal products, I would personally suggest to go with the organic animal products.
Lori, are you going to be talking more about carbohydrates?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's see what time it is. 7. Okay. So we talked about fats a little bit. So does anybody know like essential fatty acids versus non-essential fatty acids? What that means?
Maybe essential fatty acids are required to create parts of your body? Maybe?
That is true. That isn't really the definition of what they are, but that is true. And a really good guess. Yeah. So essential nutrients are ones that our liver in that big book of recipes doesn't have a recipe for. So no matter what constituent parts come in from the other foods, they can't make that.
They can't make essential fatty acids.
Right. Or essential amino acids. Anything essential.
Okay.
Which are only fatty acids and amino acids.
Your body can't.
Your body can't make on its own out of the other things. So you can't make up for everything else. Like if you get enough of the other stuff, the liver can take them apart and remake them into, you know, the other amino acids and the other fatty acids. But the essential fatty acids and the essential amino acids you have to get from your diet.
Imported.
And so there are two kinds of essential fatty acids, linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid. One is an omega-6, one is an omega-3. You don't really need to know about that. The 6 and 3 and stuff is just about the molecular structure, by the way. It's just like describing the molecular structure in a chemical kind of way. So omega-6s we get a lot of in the modern American diet. We get way more omega-6s than omega-3s. And it's not so much that omega-3s are good and omega-6s are bad. I mean, there are essential omega-6s too. It's more that, again, the balance. When we're out of balance, then it can bring our body out of balance. And so omega-6s are an essential part of many things, but one of the things that they are used for is the inflammatory process. And it doesn't mean that when we eat omega-6s, we become inflamed and we start an inflammatory process. It just means that they are used by our body to do the process of inflammation, which is a very healthy process. If we sprain our ankle, we need that ankle to become inflamed, to bring white blood cells and blood flow and to swell and to keep the damage from spreading. So inflammation is not in and of itself a bad thing. But the omega-6s are necessary for that. And then omega-3s, among many other things, are necessary for the process of anti-inflammation. So when our ankle has healed and it's time for the swelling to go down and the white blood cells to go about their business and the ankle to return to its normal state, then the process of anti-inflammation has to happen in the body. And so that's a very, very simplified look at omega-6s and omega-3s, but that's just part of why you may have heard like omega-6s are not good for you and omega-3s are good for you. It's not so cut and dry. It's just that we've leaned way, way, way in the direction of having too many omega-6s in our diets for a few generations now, and way, way, way of being deficient in omega-3s. So good sources of omega-3s are oily, deep water fish from the ocean, and all the things that they eat. So like marine plankton and algae and things like that. What's that?
Plastic.
Yeah, right. That's what they eat now. Oh, it's here for the ocean. It's true. It is true. I know. Flax oil, walnut oil, flax seeds, and walnuts. There's a lot of plant sources. Leafy greens have some. Land-dwelling animals that are eating a really plant-rich diet can have a lot of omega-3s in their eggs or in their and somewhat in the milk, but in the flesh and in the meat. So those are some ways to get omega-3s. The roles of fat in our body. So like I said about the cell membranes and the hormones, there are a lot of hormones that are made up of fats and proteins. But fats also provide a concentrated source of energy. So to have regulated blood sugar, regulated energy throughout the day, it's important to have enough fats. And they're cofactors in the absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. And so those vitamins, if we don't have enough fat in our diet, even if we get a lot of those vitamins, like we eat tons and tons of carrots to get vitamin A, but none of those carrots are like roasted in butter or olive oil, then we can't use the vitamin A. Because we need the fat in order to get those vitamins into our system. Fats are also needed for protein metabolism. They protect and cushion the organs. So it's like, yes, cushioning of our bodies that we can see, but also a really slender person maybe doesn't have as much cushioning, like they need to sit on a cushion because their butt is bony or whatever. They still have fat inside cushioning their organs. And so if you've ever slaughtered an animal, you can see like the caul fat, and there are these like sheaths of fat around the organs, and that's really important to protect the organs. Fat also slows the absorption of food, so it's not only helpful in blood sugar regulation because it itself like lets energy, you burn through the energy in fat slower. It also slows the absorption of food. So if you're eating a really sugary meal, for example, to slow the absorption of that sugar, it's good to eat fat with the sugar. So,
yeah, all right.
Yeah, I know. Okay, can do. Even like eating dried fruit with nuts, like not like ice cream and whatever, but if you're gonna eat something that's really high in concentrated carbohydrates, to eat some fat at the same time. And fat makes food taste good. So I remember in the 90s, my parents got on the train of the fat-free reality and fed me all these fat-free like box things, and they like regretted and have apologized since then. And they had tons of sugar and tons of different flavorings because food without fat doesn't taste good. It's just a reality.
And it's not filling.
No, it's not filling. So you eat more of this crappy food. So
those chocolate cookies with the marshmallows.
Totally.
So many of those. Snackwells.
Yeah, Snackwells.
Oh my god, they're so horrible.
Oh, that's
so gross.
90s Twinkies.
Yeah, totally. It took me a long time to recover from that, actually. But now I eat butter every day. Yay! Make my own butter. Yeah. So homegrown sources of fat. What are some ways that we can get fat in our diet from our farm or homestead or from our local regional food shed?
Avocados.
Nuts.
Avocados, not here, but in Florida, totally. Which is where I know that you're from. Nuts.
Meat or milk.
Yeah.
Animal products.
Yeah.
Butter.
Yep. Butter.
Mammal, roadkill.
Yeah. Totally.
Fish oil? Or is that considered
If you live near the ocean, fish is a good source. I mean, fish is a good source, but I'm just talking about like in the bioregion where you live. If you want to source that part of your diet.
Okay.
Yeah, deer, totally.
Bear fat.
Bear fat. Yeah.
The rats stealing your duck food.
Yeah. Like, render there a little.
The raccoon that's probably eating all of our food is.
Yeah. I found in my homestead journey, in terms of fat, like cooking fat to cook your food in, butter and lard are like the way to go. But there's some folks around here who've been pressing oil from hickory nuts and acorns, And acorn oil, I don't know about hickory oil, but acorn oil is very high in omega-3s, so that's a cool thing to explore.
Hyaluronic acid.
Oleic?
Acid.
Yeah. Which is the antioxidant.
Is that local? Can we buy it
Yeah.
from Oscar?
Yeah. Oscar's not doing it.
Oh, the Nutty Buddy.
the Nutty
Yeah,
Buddy.
it's the
Yeah.
Nutty Buddy.
Collective.
Yeah.
Okay, Justin.
It's expensive,
Right on.
you know,
But
but
still, it's available.
it's great. Yeah, for salads and that's a fat that an oil that you wouldn't want to eat. But yeah, it's available and it's very tasty. Okay, so moving on to protein. About 18% of our body composition is made of protein, and that's our muscles, obviously. But some other important parts of our body that are made of protein are RNA and DNA, neurotransmitters, hormones, hemoglobin, antibodies, enzymes, our nervous system, many of our organs. So protein, like I think of protein, I think of like muscles. But it's all these other things. Like when we don't get enough protein, we actually can go crazy because we're not able to make neurotransmitters and hormones. So, and the same goes with fat, actually, because they're a part of those too.
It's a thing.
So all proteins are made of 20 different amino acid building blocks. So they're just nitrogen-based molecules. That's what an amino acid basically is. And they're put together in different ways to make different proteins. And 10 of those our body can synthesize. So our in the recipe book that our liver has, there's a recipe for them. It can use all the other parts to make them. And 10 of them are essential and need to come from our diet. And 50,000, our body uses 50,000 different proteins to make all those different things. So the liver is like working hard, doing magic tricks and recipes all the time.
I love
As I
that
speak.
analogy.
It's crazy.
It's pretty wild. And so this idea of complete protein and incomplete protein, has anybody heard about that concept?
Mm-hmm.
Like this food is a complete protein, or
When
this
it has
is
like,
it-
all of the amino acids.
yeah, it has all 10 of the essential amino acids.
Like quinoa.
Rice and
Yes.
beans.
Quinoa, yeah, rice and beans is a way each individually doesn't, but when you eat them together, they do. Yeah, and it's people have often think like animal food always has all of them, and that's not true either. Animal food that's cooked, like when you have a whole animal, including the skin has like glycine and some amino acids that aren't really present in the muscle meat. The bones and the collagen have some other ones, and so when you eat like bone broth and you eat whole animals rather than just muscle meat, then you get complete protein. But you don't just get complete protein from eating like a hamburger.
So can you give me some other examples besides rice and beans? That could be a couple of combos.
Yeah. So greens with seeds often. I mean, it gets real specific, but generally like I think greens with sesame seeds are any kind of dark leafy greens
Hemp
with
seeds?
sesame seeds, pumpkin seeds. Hemp seeds are complete
Oh.
in and of themselves.
Are complete?
Yeah, so that's a good way
I've
to.
read on my buckwheat package that it's complete.
Really?
Yeah, buckwheat.
That's cool. I eat a lot of buckwheat.
A lot.
Yeah, buckwheat's great. I haven't heard that, but I believe you. So yeah, buckwheat. Let me think. Another combination. Greens and seeds is one that I eat a lot of, and I just think it's a great one.
Eggs.
Rice and beans. Yeah, eggs.
Eggs and cheese.
Okay.
Yeah, eggs and
Probably.
cheese.
Eggs by themselves.
You don't
are
need the
perfect?
cheese, but why not?
Extra punch.
Sounds good.
Okay. So eggs by themselves. Are
Eggs by
complete?
themselves are complete.
Saturated fat.
Whole eggs with the yolk and the white.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Whole eggs are like amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, they're delicious, but they're just nutritionally very balanced and
Whole,
healthful.
whole eggs?
Eggs. Yeah. Eggs. Yeah.
Back,
Mhm.
back to fat real quick. Omega 6s.
Really good
What are
question.
some examples of those?
Omega-6s are like most of the seed and most of the seed oils have some omega-6s too. Corn has it. All of the grains have omega-6s. Most animal fat has some omega-6s. It's kind of like
So it's a lot.
everything,
Yeah.
almost.
This is amazing.
Yeah, has some omega-6s. Okay, protein. What are some ways that we can grow or produce or bioregionally obtain our protein?
Grow lots of hemp plants
Hemp plants, hemp
everywhere.
seeds. Yeah. Chickens, black walnuts. Yeah. They have high omega-3
Can we
fatty
grow
acids
beans
too.
here?
What's that?
Can we grow beans here?
Beans?
Rice
Yeah.
and beans?
Yeah, totally. Rice? I don't know anybody growing rice around here. Do
You
you?
could grow rice here.
You could.
But
You could.
I mean,
Ben Fox.
they grow rice in Vermont.
Yeah, yeah.
East Shore short season.
And
Yeah.
doesn't wild rice have more?
I don't know about the nutrition of wild rice.
Nutrients.
It's a totally different plant. It's a different genus. It's not
Yeah.
even the same genus. So
And that's
Yeah.
like
Pretty
that's
you know,
nutritious.
corn,
Wild
corn and
rice.
beans
Yeah.
is actually a more traditional combination, or also a traditional combination. And corn you can definitely grow around here.
Wait, so corn and beans works as well?
Mm-hmm. Corn and beans.
What other plants have protein?
What other plants have protein?
Spinach?
All of them?
Yeah,
I can't think.
greens, leafy greens.
Are you
Yeah,
greens?
Which ones?
leafy greens are
though,
pretty good.
specifically.
Stinging nettles are very high.
Okay, I couldn't remember that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stinging nettles are particularly high. Broccoli also, especially if it's grown in nitrogen-rich soil.
Kale?
Moringa.
Moringa, totally.
Wow.
Not growing that around here. I tried.
Actually,
I tried.
somebody is.
Oh really?
Yeah,
Oh, cool.
yeah, and I
failed.
think in Marshall or Mars Hill,
Oh, cool.
yeah, with like a caterpillar thing.
Oh no, yeah,
Yeah.
Mine was just not babied enough.
Yeah.
Mushrooms are relatively high. Mushrooms are a good source, and I think combining mushrooms with, I'm not 100% sure about the combination with mushrooms. It's very hard actually to find information about about mushrooms. That's true, and about the fatty acid, essential amino acid combinations in different foods. I really did some research to try and find like, okay, this has these ones, and which ones has, and it's hard to find the specific amino acids. Potatoes are actually higher than you would think if you eat the skins. Potatoes, like an equivalent volume of cooked rice and cooked potatoes. Potatoes have a lot more protein than the rice. So yeah, nuts, stinging nettles, eggs, meat, dairy, peas, beans, pulses, seeds of any kind.
What was the word you said? Pulses?
Pulses are like a term that people use for like lentils, the lentil family of legumes, but all legumes basically.
Where does pulses come from? I've never heard that before.
I think it's from Britain. I've heard it used in Vandana Shiva uses it. He's an Indian woman, but her English is influenced by British English. But yeah, legumes, members of the Fabaceae plant family that fix nitrogen. All right, carbohydrates. Talk about carbohydrates. Any other questions about protein? I'm kind of just going through the macronutrients. You guys all look a little sleepy. At the end of the day, I was sleepy too before I came here, and I was like, all right, talking about nutrition, I'm gonna get fired up.
You're doing great.
Yeah, it's a tea. No.
Do you want to take a quick break? Like get up and stretch, and anybody need to pee? Yeah? Yes?
But
Are you saying yes? Or are
I'm
you
saying yes. So
Okay, 5 minutes. Literally 5 minutes.
Always